Mars in the seventh house, the mirror that cuts. Welcome to Mars in the seventh house in Synastry. In this overlay, we explore what happens when one person's Mars falls into another person's seventh house. The house of partnership, committed relationship, open enemies, and the one-on-one encounter with another person that holds up a mirror to the self with an unflinching and sometimes uncomfortable clarity. This is one of the most significant placements in Synastry and one of the most double-edged. The seventh house is the house of the other, the house that governs how a person relates to a significant partner, how they negotiate the fundamental tension between selfhood and union, and what they both seek and fear in the experience of genuine committed relationship. When Mars falls here in another person's chart, it does not arrive as a background influence or a peripheral pressure. It arrives at the very center of the house person's relational life, at the point where they are most invested, most vulnerable, and most fundamentally engaged with the question of what it means to be in a relationship with another human being. The stakes here are as high as Synastry gets. The seventh house governs committed partnership in its fullest sense, not the romantic pursuit of the fifth, which is desire in its more luminous and uncomplicated phase, nor the psychological merging of the eighth, which is intimacy at its most transformative and demanding, but the specific and demanding territory of sustained one-on-one commitment. It is the house of the contract, of the explicit or implicit agreement between two people to meet each other as equals, to negotiate their differences with mutual respect, and to build something together that requires both people's full and ongoing participation. In traditional astrology, the seventh house is an angular house, one of the four most powerful positions in the chart, which means that whatever occupies it, natally or through synastry overlay, carries considerable weight and prominence in the person's life. It is also, in the Hellenistic tradition, the house of open enemies as well as partners, a pairing that seems paradoxical until one understands that both categories share the same essential quality. The other person is facing you directly, fully visible, making no pretense of neutrality. The partner and the adversary are both, in the seventh house sense, people who meet you face to face. There is a traditional dimension to this placement that is worth naming clearly. Mars is in its detriment in Libra, the sign naturally associated with the seventh house. Libra is the sign of balance, diplomacy, and the careful maintenance of harmony in relationship. Everything that Mars, by its nature, is not. Mars in Libra, and by extension Mars operating in seventh house terrain, is a planet working against the grain of the environment it occupies. This does not mean Mars here is simply broken or without value. A planet in detriment retains its essential nature and can express its qualities with genuine force. But it does mean that the energy Mars brings into seventh house territory is inherently in tension with what that territory asks for. The seventh house asks for negotiation, for balance, for the willingness to meet the other person as an equal and to moderate one's own force in the interest of genuine partnership. Mars asks for none of these things. It pushes forward, it asserts, it dominates, and in the house that most fundamentally requires the subordination of pure self-assertion to the demands of genuine mutuality, that tendency is not a small complication. It is the central one. From the Mars person's perspective, the house person is immediately compelling as a relational presence, not merely as a physical or creative object of desire, but specifically as a partner. The Mars person is drawn to the house person in the context of committed relating, drawn to them as someone to be with, to build with, to negotiate with, to face directly across the particular kind of intimacy that the seventh house demands. There is a quality of genuine investment here in the relational dimension specifically. The Mars person does not merely want the house person as an experience, but as a partner in the full and demanding sense of that word. The Mars person may also find, however, that the house person brings out their combative instincts in ways that are specific to the relational context. The seventh house is where we encounter the other as a fully formed and fully present individual whose needs and desires are not always aligned with our own. and whose very separateness from us is both the source of the relationship's vitality and the source of its most persistent friction. Mars, encountering that separateness in the seventh house, does not always respond to it with patience or with the diplomatic willingness to meet the other person halfway. It responds with assertion, with the push of its own position, the force of its own needs, the instinct to win the encounter, rather than to negotiate it toward mutual satisfaction. The Mars person in this overlay may find themselves frequently in the position of the more forceful partner, the one who pushes harder, argues more persistently, and struggles most visibly with the seventh house's fundamental demand for genuine equality. From the house person's perspective, the Mars person's energy arrives at the most central and significant domain of their relational life. This can be experienced as deeply vitalizing, as the arrival of a partner who is genuinely present, genuinely engaged, and willing to meet the house person with full force rather than partial attention. The Mars person does not relate tentatively or from a distance. They show up in the house person's seventh house with a directness and an energy that the house person may find, particularly in the early stages of the relationship, genuinely compelling. There is a quality of being truly met here, of encountering a partner who takes the relationship seriously enough to bring their full self into it, including the parts of themselves that are demanding, forceful, and unwilling to pretend that partnership is without friction. The house person may also find, over time, that the Mars person's energy in their seventh house introduces a quality of persistent conflict into the very domain where the house person most needs to feel the possibility of genuine peace. The seventh house is where we bring our deepest hopes for partnership, for the experience of being met, understood, and related to with genuine equity and care. When Mars occupies this house in another person's chart, it brings those hopes into contact with a force that does not naturally operate through equity or care, but through assertion and dominance. The house person may find themselves in a relationship that is alive and engaged, but never quite at rest, in which the partnership they most deeply wanted, the experience of genuine mutuality with another person, remains perpetually just out of reach because the Mars person's force in this domain consistently tips the balance away from equality and toward a dynamic in which one person is pushing and the other is perpetually negotiating with that push. At its most constructive, Mars in the seventh house creates a relationship of genuine vitality and honest engagement, one in which both people are kept fully present and fully accountable by the force of the encounter between them. The Mars person brings a quality of passionate investment into the relational domain that the house person may find genuinely sustaining. A partner who cares enough to argue, who is present enough to push, who treats the relationship as something worth bringing their full energy to rather than something to be managed from a comfortable distance. There is real passion possible here in the committed relational dimension, a quality of intensity and engagement that keeps the partnership alive and prevents it from settling into the comfortable but deadening passivity that can afflict relationships with less Martian charge. This overlay also produces a relationship in which difficult things are faced rather than avoided. Mars in the seventh does not permit the quiet suppression of conflict that slowly poisons a relationship from within. It surfaces what is unresolved, presses on what is uncomfortable, and demands that both people engage with the actual state of the relationship rather than the comfortable fiction of it. For couples who have the capacity and the willingness to work with what Mars surfaces, this can be genuinely valuable. A partnership in which honesty is structurally enforced by the nature of the dynamic rather than requiring constant effort to maintain. The shadow dimension of this overlay is where the detriment of Mars in Libra territory becomes most consequential, and where its malefic nature carries the most direct implications for the health of the committed partnership. Mars in the seventh house, when it operates without sufficient self-awareness or genuine commitment to the principle of equality, produces a relationship dynamic in which the partnership is perpetually structured around the Mars person's force. And, The house person's management of that force in which the supposed mutuality of the seventh house is consistently undermined by the reality that one person is always pushing harder, always asserting more forcefully, always less willing to yield than the other. The specific difficulty here is that Mars in the seventh house can make conflict the default language of the relationship. The seventh house is where we negotiate difference, where we encounter the other person's genuine separateness and find ways to honor both our own needs and theirs without either person being wholly subsumed. Mars, in this domain, tends to experience the other person's separateness not as something to be honored, but as something to be overcome, as an obstacle to the satisfaction of its own needs, rather than as the very thing that makes genuine relationship possible. The result is a partnership characterized by persistent conflict, not the productive friction of two people who argue honestly and arrive at genuine understanding, but the more exhausting and demoralizing pattern of recurring battles in which the same ground is contested again and again without resolution, because the Mars person's instinct is not toward resolution, but toward victory. The question of dominance and control in the committed partnership must be addressed directly here. Mars in the seventh house, at its most difficult expression, produces a relationship in which the equality that the seventh house fundamentally requires is systematically denied, in which the Mars person's force shapes the terms of the partnership so thoroughly that the house person's own needs, preferences, and agency within the relationship are progressively subordinated to the management of the Mars person's demands. This is not the overt physical dominance of the first house or the enclosed domestic danger of the fourth. It is a relational dominance, a persistent imbalance of power in the partnership itself, enacted through argument, through force of will, through the sheer exhausting persistence of a Martian energy that does not tire of pushing in the way that the house person, whose seventh house need is for genuine mutuality, eventually does. At the more serious end of this spectrum, Mars in the seventh house is associated with partnerships that are genuinely adversarial, in which the open enemy dimension of the seventh house becomes the dominant register of the relationship, and the person who was meant to be the committed partner is experienced instead as an opponent. Legal conflict, separation conducted with hostility, and the conversion of a committed relationship into an active site of sustained opposition are all within the range of what this overlay can produce when its most difficult expressions are fully active. The seventh house governs open enemies as well as partners, and Mars here can, under sufficiently difficult conditions, collapse the distinction between the two. At its highest expression, Mars in the seventh house creates a committed partnership of genuine passion, honest engagement, and the particular kind of relational vitality that only comes from being truly met by another person. From encountering a partner who brings their full force into the relationship and demands, by doing so, that you bring yours as well. The Mars person challenges the house person to be more fully present in their own relational life, more willing to assert their own needs, more capable of holding their ground, more honest about what they actually require from a partner. The house person gives the Mars person's relational energy a worthy and substantive encounter, a partner whose genuine separateness and full personhood make the relationship worth the considerable energy Mars is prepared to invest in it. When balanced, Mars in the seventh house creates passionate commitment, honest relational engagement, genuine presence in partnership, and a relationship in which both people are kept fully alive and fully accountable by the force of what passes between them. When imbalanced, it produces chronic conflict, relational dominance, the erosion of genuine equality in partnership, and, at its most adversarial, the transformation of the committed relationship into its own opposite, a sustained and openly declared opposition between two people who once chose each other as partners. What this overlay ultimately demands of the Mars person is the most difficult thing Mars is ever asked to do: to bring its full force into a domain that requires that force to be genuinely shared, genuinely moderated and genuinely placed in service of another person's equal claim on the relationship. Mars that can learn that is Mars that has found in the 7th house its most meaningful and most demanding work. Mars that cannot is Mars that will discover, in the end, that it has turned its partner into exactly what the 7th house always warned was possible. Not a companion, but an opponent.
This was Mars in the 7th house in Synastry Overlays. Thank you for listening. Next, Mars in the 8th house.